What are the basic features of the post-capitalist economy known as a participatory economy? Find out in this episode of PEP Talk.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Welcome to PEP Talk, the podcast where we discuss the democratic alternative to capitalism known as a participatory economy. I'm your host, Mitchell Szczepanczyk, coming to you from Chicago. In this episode of PEP Talk, we'll discuss the basics of a participatory economy, what it is, how it works, why it's set up, and where it came from. We'll be talking with one of the co-inventors of the model, Robin Hahnel. Robin Hahnel is a professor at Portland State University in Portland, Oregon in the United States. He is the author of many books and articles about the alternative to capitalism known as the participatory economy. His latest book is Democratic Economic Planning, and by way of disclosure, I helped contribute to the book, and he's joining us now. Robin, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you this morning.
Thank you. We're going to be talking about the basics of what a participatory economy is. So we'll start off with a very basic question. When you're asked in like maybe 2 or 3 minutes, what is a participatory economy? How do you respond?
It's an alternative to capitalism, which I think is very consistent with the visions of early socialists, which was that we don't want bosses in our workplaces telling us what to do. Instead, we are perfectly capable of managing ourselves. And we, what used to be called in early socialist language, we, the associated producers, will manage ourselves, and the associated producers will coordinate their interrelated economic activities with one another, democratically and fairly. So a participatory economy was a very self-conscious attempt to make that vision, the vision of early socialists, and I think the vision that most socialists to this day have, more concrete in light of the many failed experiments to try and create alternatives to capitalism that occurred during the 20th century. So that is what it is. That was its purpose and its origins, to attempt to do something along those lines.
One thing that was done in the crafting of a participatory economy that has not been done for, well, I can't think of any other economic example, but before even explaining what the economy is and how it works, you set out some ground assumptions, what are termed values. Could you talk about what those values are and why you chose to set it up like that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And quite frankly, we were surprised that most of the discussions about what should socialism be like, how should a socialist economy operate, didn't begin by asking, well, what are our goals? What is it we're trying to achieve? If you want to think about designing some way to do something, then presumably you want to, start by asking, well, what goals are we trying to achieve? How are we going to know whether what we've proposed is good or bad? And so we have called that, loosely over the years, that became, that got described as, well, what are the values that a participatory economy is attempting to achieve? And the values are actually rather few in number and rather remarkably straightforward. And we think they are the values that socialists, people who were upset and unsatisfied with capitalism, have long held. The first one is economic democracy. Just like everybody most people are in agreement, you want the political system to be democratic. That wasn't always the case. Kings didn't agree with that. But certainly at this point in time, people understand that you want a political system to be as democratic as possible, and argue over how to make that act, what institutions would actually achieve that goal. Now, in that case, we have argued that in the economy, there are different ways of conceptualizing what it means for economic decisions to be made democratically. And we've argued that that we believe one should conceptualize economic democracy as people having decision-making input to various economic decisions in proportion to the degree that they are affected by those decisions. So there are some decisions, some economic decisions that more or less affect all of us equally. Well, then the democratic way to make those decisions would be everybody has the same input. On the other hand, there are a lot of economic decisions that affect some people more than others. In particular, how things are done in a workplace. Well, that affects the workers in those workplaces a lot more than it affects others, but it does affect others. It affects others, for instance, if in that workplace there are pollution emitted, So the trick or the goal is, now this is separate from how do you achieve it and is it hard or easy to achieve, but the goal should be economic democracy understood as something we also called at some point collective self-management. But economic democracy defined as try to approximate decision-making power for different people in the economy, roughly in proportion to the degree that person or group of people are affected by the economic decision. Now, the second goal is we want economic justice. I mean, this has certainly been at the forefront of all socialist movements, sort of an objection to how unfair capitalism distributes the burdens and benefits of economic activity. And this, again, is a value or a concept that's been, the subject of great controversy and debate amongst socialists. And we believe that what economic justice reduces to is people should be rewarded commensurate with the efforts and sacrifices they make. So if some people make greater sacrifices in work, then they deserve to have more consumption. They deserve to be rewarded to a somewhat greater degree. So we argue that the second value of economic justice should be understood clearly as we want a system, we want to design procedures and institutions that will reward people in accord with the efforts and the sacrifices they make in work. Now, there's another thing that needs to be taken into account here, and that is, first of all, there's a lot of people who don't work. There are young people, there are retired people, there are disabled people. Clearly, we want those people we have to have some sort of rules or approach to how it is that the consumption of those people is going to be taken care of. So need has to be taken care of also, and therefore you have to have institutions that are going to be designed so that it takes care of that beyond rewarding people who are in the workforce, people who are working according to their efforts and sacrifices. How do you also take care legitimately of legitimate needs? So reward according to effort, sacrifice, and need is the sort of economic maxim, the distributive maxim that a participatory economy is designed to achieve. We also want environmental sustainability. It's very, very clear that early socialists, my own belief is that most socialists were Johnny-come-latelys to environmental awareness. Most socialists were so concerned with other issues, important issues, the traditional issues that socialists, fought around for economic democracy and economic justice, that in some ways it took a very, very large environmental movement to drag many of us to environmental awareness. But certainly in the 21st century, any economy that is not environmentally sustainable is highly undesirable, if not disastrous. So that again is a third value. A fourth value is solidarity. Solidarity simply meaning it would be nice if the way the economy is organized is in a way that generates, that helps generate feelings of solidarity amongst people, that help generate, that help people come to a view that they wish others well, just as they expect them to wish them well. So concern for the well-being of others. It would be nice if our institutions and decision-making procedures promote that rather than promote exactly the opposite, promote distrust amongst people, envy amongst people. So that was another value that we said it was. And we recognize that that's not a value, for instance, that when you take an economics class is something that is going to be featured. In an economics class, they're going to be very concerned about whether the economy is being efficient. I've never taken an economics class in my life, and I don't think anybody else ever has, where a regular economics class would say, well, part of what would be good for an economy to achieve is encouraging solidarity, rather than increasing the mistrust and divisiveness amongst people. And then the final one is, we said, we also think another value is something we just call variety, that all other things being equal, a greater variety of options and outcomes are desirable. John Stuart Mill once made the point this way, and this is in his essay on liberty. He said, sometimes a minority, the minority opinion turns out to be right. And therefore, there is a good argument for allowing people who are in a minority, and in this case, we're talking about people who are in a minority about what's the best kind of life. What's the best kind of life to lead? Sometimes there's a strong argument and case to be made that it's in everybody's interest to allow people to go ahead and be contrarians to the general flow, because sometimes it turns out they're right, and then we all benefit from the fact that people were permitted freely to experiment with sort of whatever sort of lifestyles they wanted. So those were the values. We said economic democracy defined as decision-making input in proportion to the degree you're affected. Economic justice understood to mean reward for people working according to their sacrifices and the efforts they make, as well as taking care of legitimate needs. Environmental sustainability, which again, can be defined in different ways and can be very tricky. So you have to sort of look exactly at what that turns out to mean. We'll talk about how the institutions are designed to do that. And also, it's a positive thing when an economy encourages solidarity. It's problematic if an economy discourages it. And it's important that an economy generate a variety of options and encourage people to explore a variety of different lifestyles and life options. So those, we said, was, why wouldn't you start with the goals before you ever sit down to even begin to talk about, well, what sort of economic institutions and decision-making procedures would best achieve those goals, or at least best achieve those goals, at least in approximation.
Which leads us to, I guess, what at least descriptions of a participatory economy refer to as the institutions. I like to refer to them as the rules of the game. How would an economy work? In the last century or so, we've seen how the economies, capitalist and communist or socialist economies, have worked. They've made clear their rules. People can see how they work. Whether or not they like them or not is for them to decide. But here, moving on to the rules of the game for a participatory economy, Robin, what would be the rules of a participatory economy? We've got the values, you've got the baseline. I guess for this game, you know how you're going to keep score, to continue on with this metaphor. What would be the rules that would improve our score within this setup of a participatory economy. Can you talk about that some, please?
Okay. And I mean, the first institution is something that has a long, and honorable history in the history of socialist economic thought: workers' councils. So we propose that the first the first institution is that in a workplace, all those who are working are members of what we call a workers' council, and that workers' council is run democratically. That the members of the worker council are the ones who make all the decisions about what it is that workers' council will do. Now, if it's a very large workplace, like a huge steel mill or something like that, then there are probably going to be subunits. There's going to be people working in the blast furnace. There's going to be people working in the rolling mills. In those different units, if you have a workplace with 10,000 people in it, you are probably going to want subunits that are making a lot of decisions about what goes on in their place, themselves. But in broad principle, it's democracy. There's a workers' council that is the ultimate decision maker for the workplace. Every worker has one vote in that workers' council. It's analogous to the stockholders in a capitalist corporation. Now, the difference is the stockholders in a capitalist corporation, they get as many votes as shares of stock they own, and they aren't the workers who work there. But in this case, every worker in a workplace, from the most recent arrival to the person who's been there for 20 years, has one vote in the workers' council, which is the ultimate decision-making body for the workplace about all concerns. We also propose something we call neighborhood consumption councils. That consumption, and this is something that early socialists, I believe, did not think as much about as it's proven necessary, as we now know should be. And that is, just as you have to think carefully about how production is organized, you have to think carefully about how consumption is organized. And so what we've proposed is that there be neighborhood consumption councils, defined geographically, that comprise all of the households. And we can go back and talk about what's a household. Well, a household could be two parents and their children. A household could be a commune of 10 young people. But all the households that are who live in a neighborhood would be what we call a neighborhood consumption council. And those neighborhood consumption councils would be participating together with the workers' councils in coordinating their interrelated economic activities. But the neighborhood consumption councils would also be self-governing. They would go about deciding all the kinds of things that have to be decided about how consumption is going to go on in that neighborhood. The third sort of important feature, the third essential institution is, well, you've explained that we're going to have self-governing neighborhood consumption councils, and you've explained that we're going to have self-governing workers' councils. But of course, all of these councils, both worker councils and consumption councils, they're related, their activities are highly interrelated. The steel mill needs coal from another workplace that's mining coal. The automobile factory needs steel from the steel mill. And all of these workers' councils producing things, the only reason that they're producing things is because there are people in neighborhoods who want to consume things. So here we get to the sort of famous question, the famous economic question, which is, what is your procedure that you embrace or propose for integrating the interrelated economic activities of different workplaces and consumers? And there's two traditional answers to that question. The first and best known is markets. The workers' councils sell their outputs in markets, they buy their inputs in markets. The consumers, whether through neighborhood consumer councils or individually, are with their income, they're going out and buying things. And the way that all these interrelated economic activities are coordinated is through markets. Now, if you go back into the 20th century, the alternative that evolved for decades and decades and decades in the Soviet Union and various Eastern European countries, China for a while, Cuba still to this day, was, well, no, I mean, markets are part of capitalism, and instead we want to plan how these different workplaces and neighborhood consumption councils are coordinated. And the system of planning that evolved in the 20th century was called central planning. And we believe that it was fundamentally flawed, that became apparent as the decades rolled on. It became apparent sooner to some socialists than it did to others. But at this point in time, there are very few people, who would say that's a better alternative to markets, and we certainly don't. Instead, what we propose is something called participatory planning. And in some regards, it's rather easy to describe, but in other respects, it's more complicated. And in some ways, based on the experience of the 20th century, the major desirable features of a planning system are things that you really have to dig into the weeds a lot more than early socialists thought would be necessary. Another way of putting it is, I think early socialists thought that for the associated producers to coordinate their division of labor amongst themselves, once freed from the capitalist yoke, would be a relatively simple and straightforward thing. Well, I think even when we were first sort of thinking and imagining the alternative of participatory economy back in the 1980s, even that far back, it was readily apparent that this is a little more complicated and difficult than early socialists assumed. And that's one of the lessons of 20th century history. A desirable alternative to both markets and central planning is perhaps a little more complicated and a little more difficult to think through than people originally presumed. But in any case, the third major institution, workers' councils, neighborhood consumption councils, and it turns out we're going to need federations of these different councils also, for making certain kinds of decisions, that they all participate in something called a participatory planning procedure for coming up with what? Well, coming up with a plan for what everybody is going to do next year. So we have participatory annual planning, and we have to describe how that operates. And I will briefly sort of explain what's the essential nature of how it is that annual participatory planning occurs. But we have more recently, we have made proposals about how can you make investment planning both participatory and efficient. And there's various kinds of long-term development planning. There's long-term education planning and there's long-term environmental planning that now is apparent. And if we're talking about national economies, there's long-term international strategic economic planning that we believe it's sensible for economies to engage in. So one also has to design procedures for how it is that all of these kinds of long-term development planning operations should proceed, and how it is that just normal investment planning should proceed. In terms of annual economic planning, how have we proposed that an annual plan be created? Our proposal is essentially this, that workplaces make a production proposal for themselves. So every workplace says, this is what we would like to do next year. This is what we would like to produce. And in order to do that, we are going to need the following things from other workplaces. And neighborhood consumption councils are going to go ahead and say, this is what the people in our neighborhood would like to consume. Households say they want to do this individual consumption. The neighborhood as a whole we want swings for a new park. We have to repair our sidewalks. So neighborhood consumption councils aggregate the household consumption proposals that they approve as being fair based on the incomes of the people in those households, and add on their own sort of neighborhood collective consumption proposals. And when they make this proposal, the neighborhood consumption councils, so we have workers' councils proposing what I would call self-activity for themselves. We have neighborhood consumption councils proposing self-activity for themselves. Nobody is proposing activities for others. They're basically proposing self-activity proposals. How are workers' councils going to go about making these proposals? And what they need to know in order to make a proposal is, well, how valuable are different outputs that we might make? And how much would it cost society for us to use different inputs that we require? So they're going to need some sort of estimates of the social benefits of certain kinds of goods they might produce or services they might provide. And they're going to need an estimate of what it costs society for them to use different inputs. In the beginning of the year, we don't know what those are. We don't know, given the technological capabilities and the preferences of consumers and the availability of different inputs. We don't know what the social costs and benefits of different things are. But the annual planning, so we begin with maybe what last year's best estimates were, or some preliminary estimates. But that is how a workers' council would evaluate its own proposals. It would basically say, why should others agree that we go ahead and do what we propose? Well, presumably, if what we're proposing, if the social benefits of the outputs that we are proposing to provide, if they are at least as large as the social cost of using the inputs, then it would be in everybody's interest to agree that we be allowed to go along and do what we've just proposed. So that is the role played by these estimates of social benefits and costs. And this is a little bit of the tech, this is getting into the weeds. But what we've demonstrated is that our annual planning procedure could start with arbitrary estimates of social costs and benefits, which would be used by the workers' councils and the neighborhood consumer councils to evaluate their own proposals and come to some sort of conclusion about, is everybody else going to be agreeable with what we'd like to do? That as the annual planning procedure goes on, as we go from one round to the next round to the next round, the estimates of these social benefits and costs is going to get closer and closer to what they actually truly are. So in the end, what happens is, as long as the social benefits exceed the social costs of a workers' council proposal, it's in everybody's interest to say, we're happy to go ahead and have you do what you want to do. And as long as the incomes, that's the efforts and the sacrifices of the people, in the households, plus any special needs allocations for children and retired people in households, as long as the income of the consumers in the neighborhood consumption council is high enough to justify the social costs of what they're asking to consume, well, then it's perfectly fair and just that they be allowed to go ahead and consume what they've asked. So that's basically the nature of the annual planning procedure. It's really qualitatively different from any planning procedure, any comprehensive planning procedure that anybody has ever proposed or that was ever attempted in any of the old so-called socialist economies. It's a procedure in which workers and consumers propose their own activity in a context where they can judge with whether what they are proposing is both efficient and fair, and when all of the rest of them can see that just as clearly as can see that clearly. So that's the essential nature of that annual participatory planning procedure. And it really is, in many, many ways, at least from the point of view of coordinating the interrelated activities of millions of different households and hundreds of thousands of different enterprises and workplaces. It's really the sort of unique and distinctive feature of the proposal of a participatory economy. It's what distinguishes it from sort of market alternatives to capitalism, and distinguishes it from all of the sort of more traditional approaches to central planning, which in our view inevitably degenerate into a kind of authoritarian planned economy in which workers become increasingly alienated and discouraged from trying to manage their own work activities.
There's one institution that we haven't discussed, but which I'd like you to talk about now for a couple of minutes, that was been referred to as balanced jobs. Could you explain what that is and how that would work?
Yes. If you take a look at most jobs in capitalism, go to most workplaces in capitalism and look at the employees. What you'll discover is that there's a small minority of employees who spend their time thinking, meeting, trying to make decisions about how the workplace will operate, whether it will produce a somewhat different product, whether it will sort of change the way that change to a new technology. And most people just show up and do what they're told. So that's what capitalist workplaces look like. Sadly, that's what most workplaces looked like in the Soviet Union during most of the 20th century. There were managers, sometimes overseen by sort of commissars, political commissars, but there were managers and commissars who decided what would go on in the factory, and everybody else was just told to show up, shut up, do what you're told. We don't think that in any way is consistent with the visions of early socialists or people who would like something different. But the fact of the life, so what are you going to do about that? And it seems to us that there's a very strong argument to be made that you would like to balance the tasks that people have in their job descriptions so that everybody has some empowering tasks in their job description. Another way to think about it is this. Suppose you have a workplace where the jobs are traditional jobs, and we have a Democratic Workers' Council, and everybody goes to the Democratic Workers' Council to discuss, debate, and vote on what the workplace is going to do. Is it really going to be true that everybody in that workplace has had an equal opportunity to meaningfully participate in democratic decision-making just because they have one vote each? If a minority of people have been doing all these empowering tasks as their work, and everybody else has been doing just rote tasks, what frequently are described as rote tasks, then you haven't prepared everybody in the workplace to be equally capable of participating effectively in democratic economic decision-making in that workplace. So that's the whole point. The whole point is you want to redesign jobs so that everybody does some tasks that are empowering. Those tasks should not be monopolized by a small percentage of people in the workplace. Otherwise, what will happen is that formal democracy, everybody has one vote in the worker council, will eventually disintegrate. it will disintegrate into a system where it is still a small minority of people in the workplace that are basically making the decisions, and everybody else is just along for the ride. So that was the proposal, that a really good economy would be one in which in which jobs inside workplaces are designed in a way that they attempt to balance empowering tasks along with tasks that are less empowering. That's a delicate process. And how to go about it in any particular workplace depends on the technological options, et cetera. So our proposal is, this is something that workers' councils should aspire to. This is something that they should put at the top of their sort of to-do list when they're sort of organizing themselves, and at the top of their do list should be, we need to be redesigning work in this workplace, taking this new goal in mind, which is helping having the tasks that people perform help enable everybody in the workplace to be a more effective participant in the democratic process of decision-making in our workplace. So that was what that is about. And it's certainly a very unique, it is a second very unique part of the proposal for a participatory economy compared to all the other alternatives out there. It's been it's both unique, and in some ways it's been very controversial.
I think we're at time, so I'll just end it here. This has been PEP Talk, the podcast where we discuss the democratic alternative to capitalism known as participatory economy. To find out more, visit the website participatory-economy.org. Again, participatory-economy.org. I'm your host, Mitchell Szczepanczyk from Chicago. We've been talking with Robin Hahnel from Portland, Oregon in the United States about the basics of a participatory economy. Thank you very much for your attention. We'll see you again. Goodbye.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Self-management, democratic control of communities or workplaces, federal arrangements.
Participatory democratic planning.
Jobs to have a mix of empowered work, nested councils linked to one another. Everyone gets to participate in a primary council.
Please visit participatory-economy.org to find out more and subscribe to our newsletter. And don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks, and see you at the next episode.